Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Jaya Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivara Dhari Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivara Dhari Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivara Dhari Gopi Jana Prabhupada ki jai. ISKCON founder Acharya Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Jai Vishnupada Paramahamsa Parivrajaka Stotra Satsi Srimad Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur ki jai. Nandavati Vaishnava Vrinda ki jai. Acharya Sri Haridas Thakur ki jai. Prem se Guru Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhar Sri Vasadi Gaur Bhaktivinoda ki jai. Sri Sri Radha Krishna Gopinath Shama Kunda Radha Kunda Giri Govardhan ki jai. Vrindavan Dham ki jai. Mayapur Dham ki jai. Jagannath Swami ki jai. Ganga Mai ki jai. Jamuna Mai ki jai. Tulsi Devi ki jai. Bhakti Devi ki jai. Samaveta Bhakta Vrinda ki jai. All glories to the assembled devotees. Gaur Premananda.
Namaste.
Oh, so text 13 or 14?
13's on the board.
No, 13's on the board. No, this is the nature tour of Narada Muni. So, are you recording?
Did you turn it
Yeah,
on?
I turned on.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So, this is a long verse, so Nala, Venu, Sharas, Tanva, Kusha, Kichaka, Gahwaram, Eke, Eva, actually it's Eka, Atiyato, Ham, Adraksham, Vipinam, Mahat, Gauram, Pratibhaya, Akara, Vyaloluka, Shivajiram, Nalavenu Sharastanba, Kushaki Chakagahwaram, Eka Evati Atoham, Draksham Vipinam Mahat, Gaudam Pratibhayakara, Vyaloluka Shivajiram, Nalavenu Sharastanva, Kushaki Chakagahwaram, Eka Evati Atoham, Draksham Vipinam Mahat, Gaudam Pratibhayakaram, Vyaloluka Shivajiram. Does anyone dare to chant this?
Nalavenu Sarastamba, Chichaka Govaram,
Kushaki Chakagahwaram,
with you in the way, Eka Evati Atoham,
Eka Evati Atoham,
Adiksham Vipinam Mahat,
Draksham Vipinam Mahat,
Goram Pratibarikaram,
Gauram Pratibhayakaram,
Vyaloluka Shivajiram,
Nalavenu Sharastanva,
Nalavenu Sharastanva,
Kushaki Chakagavaram,
Kushaki Chakagahwaram,
Eka Evatiatoham,
Eka Evati Atoham,
Adraksham Vipinam Mahat,
Draksham Vipinam Mahat,
Ghoram Pratibhayakaram, Vyaloluka Shivajiram.
So, the ladies.
Nalavenu Sharastanba, Kushaki Chagavaram,
Kushaki Chakagahwaram,
Eka Evati Atoham, Adraksham Vipinam Mahat, Ghoram Pratibhayakaram, Vyaloluka Shivajiram, Nalavenu Sharastamba, Kushaki Chakagavaram, Eka Evati Atoham, Adraksham Vipinam Mahat, Goram Pratibhayakaram, Vijaloluka Shivajaram.
So, Nala means pipes, Venu bamboo, Shara pens, Tanba full of, Kusha sharp grass, Kichaka weeds. Told you it's a nature tour. Gahuram caves, Eka Eva, Eka alone, Eva, only Atiyata, difficult to go through, Aham I, Draksham visited, Vipinam, deep forests, Mahat, great, Goram, fearful, Pratibhayakaram, dangerously, Vyala, snakes, Uluka, owls, Shiva, jackals, Ajitam, playgrounds. So just sort of your typical state park here. Oh, it's actually a very dangerous place. So, Prabhupada's translation, I then passed alone through many forests of rushes, bamboo, reeds, sharp grass, weeds, and caves. Very difficult to go through alone. I visited deep, dark, and dangerously fearful forests, which were the play yards of snakes, owls, and jackals. This is a child, by the way. This is a 5-year-old child. What was her name again?
Tulasi.
Tulasi. This is about Narada, and he was only 5 years old. He was even younger than you. He was only a 5-year-old boy, and he went through all these dangerous places. So, Prabhupada's purport, it is the duty of a mendicant, Parivrajaka. Pari means around, Vrajaka means wandering, and Acharya, teacher that wanders around, hopefully teaching. So, it is a duty of a mendicant, Parivrajaka Acharya, to experience all varieties of God's creation by traveling alone through all forests, hills, towns, villages, etc., to gain faith in God and strength of mind, as well as to enlighten the inhabitants with God's message. A sannyasi is duty-bound to take all these risks. Do you think it's Krishna arrangement that I'm reading this verse today?
At New Talavan.
What's that?
At New Talavan.
At New Talavan, yes. It is a sannyasi's duty. A sannyasi is duty-bound to take all these risks without fear. And the most typical sannyasi of the present age is Lord Chaitanya, who traveled in the same manner through the central Indian jungles, enlightening even tigers, bears, snakes, deer, elephants, and many other jungle animals. In this age of Kali, sannyas is forbidden for ordinary men. One who changes his dress to make propaganda is a different man from the original ideal sannyasi. One should, however, take the vow to stop social intercourse completely and devote life exclusively to the Lord's service. The change of dress is only a formality. Lord Chaitanya did not accept the name of a sannyasi, and in this age of Kali, the so-called sannyasis should not change their former names, although following in Lord Chaitanya's footsteps. In this age, devotional service of hearing and repeating the holy glories of the Lord is strongly recommended, and one who takes the vow of renunciation of family life need not imitate the Parivrajaka Acharya like Narada or Lord Chaitanya, but may sit down at some holy place and devote his whole lifetime and energy to hear and repeatedly chant holy scriptures left by the great acharyas like the 6 Goswamis of Vrindavan. Prabhupada ki jai. So we have a very complex purport here. So the first, Nalavenu Sharas Tanba Kusakichaka Gahwaram. These are just all the topography and the flora and fauna that Narada Muni traveled through. Eka Eva, which means all alone. All alone. Eka Eva, Narada speaking, Ati Yatoham. Aham means I, Yata means went, and Ati means over. So I went over, in other words, in the sense that I passed through all these different places. Draksham, I saw. This is simple, like the Sanskrit verb drish, to see. Darshana means seeing. So here we have the form of the past tense. Adraksham, I saw. Or as Prabhupada translates, I visited. So Adraksham, Vipinang Mahad, a great forest. I saw a great forest, which was Ghoram, frightening, Pratibhayakaram, and it was, Prabhupada translates this here, dangerously, it was full of all kinds of danger coming at me, Pratibhayakaram. Vyala, snakes, uluka, owls. Owls actually are, we always see owls in cartoons when we're kids, and it's like these cute little birds that sleep during the day and wake up at night. But actually, they're very large. You ever seen a real owl? They're very large, and they're very dangerous, and they have big claws, and they just eat little mammals. So these are not the cartoon owls. So pratibhayakaram, Shiva means a jackal, ajitam. So Prabhupada here talks about sannyas. Narada Muni, quite precocious. He's only a 5-year-old boy, and he just leaves home. We have kind of like these super kids in the Bhagavatam. Another super kid is Dhruva Maharaj, at the age of 5, left home. He was insulted by his father, travels through the world, meets Narada Muni, and undergoes this frighteningly austere yoga practice, and then of course sees Krishna. And here, so we have these two sort of wunderkind, these two super kids, Narada and Dhruva. And of course Prahlad Maharaj, also 5 years old. So actually there's 3 super 5-year-olds. But here, Narada Muni basically renounced the world. Basically, he, as we know, when he was a little child, the Bhaktivedantas, as Prabhupada calls them, the saintly Vaishnavas, came during the rainy season. You heard of Chaturmasya. Masa in Sanskrit just means month. And so Chaturmasya means the 4-month period. The climate of North India is such that during the monsoon season, for 4 months, there's a tremendous amount of rain. And the sages who would travel around would walk, basically. They didn't even take chariots, and there was never no Uber cars back then. So they would walk, and the roads weren't paved. So during the rainy season, the roads were flooded, and there was mud, and it's just not a time to travel. So they would stop. Now this idea of a rolling stone gathers no moss, the idea of a sannyasi traveling is in order not to form attachments. Because we all know, it's just the nature of the world that when Krishna says himself in the Bhagavad Gita, Dhyayato vishayan pungsas sangasteshu pajayate. If you're always looking at something over and over again and staring at it, after a while you become attached to it. It's just, it's sort of built into our neuropsychology, whatever you want to call it. I mean, we all have this experience. We all have the experience, say, whether you're a boy or a girl, that you meet someone, at first they don't seem very attractive to you, but if you just keep seeing them, seeing them, at a certain point, one starts to become attached to someone that, and then you can't live without them, although, 5 weeks ago you couldn't care less if you never saw them again. And so it's just the nature. That's why Krishna says dhyayato, which literally means for one who's meditating on, or like really focused on. Dhyayato bishayan, sense objects. Like, I've got to have that. Dhyayato bishayan pungsas sangas, attachment teshu pajayate. So attachment arises to those sense objects. So for sannyasi, imagine, let's say a sannyasi comes into a village, stops in a little village or farmhouse, and the men go out to work during the day, and so who stays home? The ladies. And so the ladies are, taking care of these sannyasis, and maybe if they stay there for a few weeks or, a month or a year or something, well, anyway, you've seen enough movies to know what happens next. So, therefore, the sannyasis would travel. Now, interestingly, there's 4 months when they can't travel because of the weather. And so, then what? therefore, during this Chaturmasya, these 4 months, the sannyasis or mendicants would perform all kinds of austerities. That's why you hear about like Chaturmasya Vrata, these Chaturmasya vows where you don't eat this and you don't eat that, or you only eat this or that, or I mean, and some of them get very extreme, like Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur when he was younger, performs some extreme. So why all these Chaturmasya vows? Because if you can't travel and you're going to stay somewhere for 4 months, you'd better make sure your senses aren't too frisky, or, and so that was the idea. They would perform these special austerities. They would eat less, so that, because Krishna says in the Gita that Visaya vinivartante niraharasya dehinam, that when an embodied soul doesn't eat very much, the senses get weak. So it was this strategy to perform special Chaturmasya vows during the time they couldn't travel, so they wouldn't get themselves in trouble. And then when the rain stopped, off they went, and they could just have a good meal again.
Can you turn this light off, please? It's really bright.
Better to see you, my dear. So, was that the big bad wolf or something? So, anyway, so here Narada Muni is traveling around, and he's only 5 years old. He's only 5 years old, but he really shows all the signs of a mature transcendentalist. And Prabhupada's purport here is, of course, quite interesting. His duty of a mendicant, and Prabhupada calls the Parivrajaka mendicant. Of course, from the Latin word meaning to beg. If you know Spanish, mendigar, which means to beg. And so in English we have mendicant. Because, in other words, we're not talking here about traveling salesmen. Someone that travels around and makes deals, makes money. And so in that sense, someone who travels around, not on business, but just witnessing or learning about God's creation or preaching, in a sense, has to be a mendicant, unless he has a little suitcase with him with all kinds of interesting objects for sale. But assuming someone's a real mendicant, then you have to be a mendicant. You have to depend on others because you're just going here and there. You have no business or home and so on. So Prabhupada said it is a mendicant's duty to experience all varieties of God's creation. Why? Why is it a duty of a mendicant to experience all the varieties? Well, for one thing, if you're going to give up this world, you better know what you're giving up. Otherwise, you may have renouncer's remorse. Just like they call, buyer's remorse, where you buy something and the next day, oh my God, why did I spend all this money? And so that's buyer's remorse. You can have renouncer's remorse, like, okay, I renounce the world, I'm a great devotee, and oh, I never saw this place, or I never met a girl like you. And so you can see that if you're going to give up the world, you'd better know what you're giving up. So later you don't regret the fact that you gave it up. So in that sense, it's the duty to go all over, and of course at other people's expense. It's one of the perks of sannyas. And Prabhupada said to gain faith in God and strength of mind, as well as to enlighten the inhabitants with the message of God. Strength of mind. How strength of mind? Well, for one thing, everyone in this world sort of has a natural homing tendency. And in other words, you just want to have a sense of home. Even though we know philosophically that this is not our real home, we have to go back to home, back to Godhead. Our real home is the spiritual world, but we are here now. We are in this world now, and it's nice to have a home, some place where you can just settle down and relax and somehow feel you belong somewhere. And but if someone is traveling a lot, then, or a sannyasi, parivrajaka, then you may not have that facility so much, so that takes strength of mind. Of course, Prabhupada did both. Prabhupada traveled all around the world, and he said, Vrindavan is my home. Of course, Vrindavan is everyone's eternal home, but still, traveling around, some people, of course, like to travel. Some people are just sort of born gypsies. and they just like to do that. But for most people, traveling is, there's some inconvenience involved, and it takes strength of mind. And Prabhupada says, enlighten the inhabitants with the message of God. Yes, I remember a couple of times I was with Prabhupada, many times I was with Prabhupada when he was answering his letters. Prabhupada used to answer letters in the morning, never wanted to waste time, so Prabhupada for his health would get a morning massage. Often he would like to be in the sun for his massage. In fact, if you go to visit his Los Angeles quarters, because just the way that his 3 rooms were facing and so on, and the windows often didn't get direct sunlight, so he would sit under a skylight. There's a skylight in one of the rooms, and probably many times I sat when he would sit under the skylight to get the sun. Then he would answer his letters during his massage. As he was taking massage, a servant, secretary would come and read the letters. He would answer, and the servant, secretary would take notes and then type up the letters. So, forgot what point I was making about that. Just got absorbed in that Prabhupada pastime. Anyway, so I remember sitting with Prabhupada in Los Angeles while he was answering letters, and some devotee wrote and wanted to take sannyasa. So it was kind of like this lust for renunciation back then. Because, for 2 reasons. One reason is that we were young and idealistic and had very little experience of the world, or you could say very little self-knowledge. We knew we were a spirit soul, but that's about all we knew about ourselves. Because when you have this powerful conversion experience when you're very young, first of all, young people obviously are immature. I would say especially, scientifically, especially young men are immature. And you just haven't lived long enough to know yourself. And then when you have this very powerful experience of discovering Krishna, and Krishna becomes everything in Bhakti Yoga, and so it's... in a sense, because you're going through that discipline, that regulated life, where, okay, everybody, line up, you're in the ISKCON army now, that's the way it used to be, and so everybody dresses the same way and goes to the same program, and this is the right way to speak, and this is the right way to think, and this is the spiritual practice, and, it's a good discipline. It's a good discipline for getting trained up, but it's perhaps not the best situation to learn about yourself, in a sense, because it's a very regimented life. And if you're very young anyway, you don't know much about yourself. And so, obviously, all the sociological, psychological factors, so people, these young men didn't understand themselves very well and didn't understand life very well. We definitely thought back then that the way I feel now, it'll just get better and better. I'm always going to be kind of young and zealous and all that. And we had no idea, we couldn't imagine in our wildest dreams that being, let's say, 30 is not exactly the same as being 20. Or that being 40 is not exactly the same as being 20. Isn't it, Yogi?
Yeah.
And so we didn't, we weren't like really strong on mature self-knowledge. And so a lot of people in this enthusiasm wanted to take sannyas. Also because there were certain perks. If you took sannyas back then, you became an overnight celebrity in ISKCON. And not to speak of the free lunch. So, we were conditioned souls. It's not that every young devotee in ISKCON at the time was a pure devotee. And so the idea of becoming famous and having all kinds of people looking up to you and always getting to give the class, always getting to give the class instead of waiting your turn and all that. I suppose that might have added a little inducement, a little incentive, although I don't think people were grossly selfish in that way, but you put all this together, and Prabhupada used to get letters from devotees asking to take sannyas, and Prabhupada knew they weren't ready. And so I remember hearing him say it when he was hearing one of these letters, like, sort of said in his own way, like, what's the rush? What is this? And he said, sannyas is just a change of dress. It's a change of dress. Someone could be a very foolish person and in a sannyas dress, and it's possible to really be a fool, even though you're dressed as a sannyasi. So the real point, as some of us know, So the real point here is to actually do the work. To actually have the courage to give up certain things, or the strength, or just be at the right time of your life, and to be able to really teach, to be dedicated to teaching. In a sense, one has to be a born teacher. As we know, there are 4 varnas, and so if one is not a born teacher, it's not really just what you do, you teach. You teach, you study. Then, even if someone has sannyas dress, inevitably their real propensities can come out. And there are sannyasis that have been doing business for the last 30 years, while simultaneously pointing out all the problems of women. Anyway, I won't get into that. So if one does not really have a teaching propensity, then you're going to end up doing something else. You're going to end up like wanting to manage. Why? Because it's your nature. It's your nature. And Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita 3:33, Sadrasham cheshtate swasya prakritir jnanavanapi. Even a learned person acts according to their own nature. This is a very literal translation. Sadrasham cheshtate swasya prakritir jnanavanapi. Prakritim janti bhutani. Living beings follow their nature. Nigraha kinkarishati. What will repression do? So even if one can just memorize slokas and read Prabhupada's books and everything, you're still going to follow your nature. And so if someone takes sannyas and doesn't really understand their human nature, and it turns out they have a real propensity for managing, and they end up managing. As we know, when you manage, you have to make decisions, and someone doesn't like your decision. You know what it's like to manage. I mean, those of us who have managed know you can never please everyone, and sometimes you can't please anyone. It's just the nature of management. It's so funny because Prithu Maharaj, the divine Prithu Maharaj, is the incarnation of management on earth, and some people thought he wasn't a good manager. It's actually in the Bhagavatam. 4th canto. So what if someone has taken sannyas but really has a managing propensity, or a Vaishya propensity, as we see sometimes? Someone is just inclined to buy and sell things, and and so they do it in sannyas dress. So now there's really 2 kinds of sannyas here in a sense. One is if, let's say, you got married, you had your kids and grandkids, you went through the whole thing, and then you renounce. I mean, you've seen it all, you've lived life, and now you just want to renounce and study Shastra and teach. So whatever your propensity was when you were young, you can get to a certain age where that's it. I remember my own father. He had a very good father. He did business. He owned various stores and everything in Los Angeles. But he really worked hard. He really worked hard. And by the time he retired, he was in his 60s or something. He was just perfectly happy just to sit down and do nothing. I remember like if someone in the family, one of my brothers needed their car fixed, and you had to drop the car off and just wait a few hours. He was happy to do it. I remember one of my brothers saying to him, "Are you sure you're not going to get bored?" No, not at all. He could just doing nothing for him was ecstatic. So when you get to a certain age in life, if you worked hard, if you really, obviously, my father wasn't a devotee, he'd never heard the word varnashram, but he did do his duty. He worked very, very hard, took care of a family with 4 sons and a wife, and he was moral, virtuous, was faithful, a faithful husband, dedicated father, and so he did his duty. On a human level, he did his duty, and by doing that duty, toward the end of his life, he could really give that up, and he didn't miss it. So an older person that takes sannyas, whatever your varna was, if you've really done your duty and worked hard and you want to now renounce and just think about Krishna. But otherwise, if you're not an older person that's worked hard and raised children and done everything, you'd better make sure you got the right varna. before you take sannyasa. Otherwise, you practically become a social disturbance. What's that verse by Rupa Goswami? That
Shruti Smriti Purana.
yeah, Shruti Smriti
Puranadi.
Puranadi Pancharata Vidhin Vina Aikanti Ki Hare Bhakti Patayaiva Kalpi. So so we see if a sannyasi really has a business propensity, it really becomes kind of a disturbance in society. An active Vaishya propensity, let's say. Because on the one hand, everybody's supposed to bow down and offer respect to the sannyasi. On the other hand, he's making deals. And who wants to bow down to someone that's, doing business with you? Or if someone has a managing propensity and you're supposed to honor this person and be humble and all that, and this person is just kind of telling everybody what to do. So, and it becomes a problem. It can become a problem. And if someone's a guru and has a strong managing propensity, and so wants to manage his disciples in ways that really go beyond just being a spiritual leader. So this is like real world stuff. This is kind of Krishna conscious sociology, and I think ultimately in life, to think is better than not thinking, and to open your eyes is better than driving through life with your eyes closed. Because that's really what we have to do now. We actually have to build a spiritual society, and that requires intelligent people. Prabhupada didn't come to form a Shudra society. I mean, you don't need to try for that. Prabhupada came to form a Brahminical society. And a Brahminical society is one in which everyone is not just told to shut up and do what you're told. That's a Shudra society. That's a Shudra society. A Brahminical society is one in which responsible ladies and gentlemen, devotees, talk among themselves. And obviously you can go to the other extreme. On any road, you can go off the road on either side. So you can, in the name of free speech, one can just promote anarchy and chaos. And nothing can get done, and it's just a big mess. So obviously there has to be a balance between legitimate hierarchy, authority, people do their duty, and at the same time having an open, free society where responsible Vaishnavas who are faithful to Prabhupada discuss among themselves. And actually this was Prabhupada's vision for ISKCON. A quote from Prabhupada, he said that ISKCON exists to train people to be independently thoughtful and expert. Again, within reasonable boundaries. It doesn't mean in ISKCON, like, okay, this person believes in Krishna, this person is an atheist, but everyone has their right. No. Obviously, in any society, there have to be reasonable boundaries. And we have, Prabhupada's teachings are our philosophical boundaries. And in terms of our spiritual practice, we also have a standard. So, most devotees in ISKCON can't do everything. Most devotees, I'd say probably 99% of the members of ISKCON don't come into a temple room in the morning and spend 4.5 hours there. It's just, that's just the reality of this movement. But there's a standard. In other words, we know that ultimately there should, Mongol Arati and chanting 16 rounds, following principles. If we all agree on the standard, then however much you're able to do, we can all work together, united in a society, because we all agree on what our goals are, we all agree on what our principles are. So there are, actually, as I point out in some of the papers I wrote, which some people actually read, there are 3 areas there are 3 things that Prabhupada did not want changed. He would not tolerate change. And that is our philosophy. Can't change our philosophy. Our basic spiritual practice. The initiation vow, we promise chant 16 rounds, follow 4 principles. So, we have a sadhana bhakti that Prabhupada taught. And again, everyone doesn't do everything, but we agree on what our principles are. For example, even when Prabhupada was here, I spent actually most of my time, after a certain point, traveling and preaching. And for 2 years, I was living in a van, traveling around to colleges, and we didn't have a full morning temple program. We certainly did kirtan, we chanted our rounds, we followed the principles, and we read Prabhupada's books, but it wasn't a full temple program. But basically, we have a spiritual practice, and we have a philosophy. The third thing Prabhupada didn't want changed is our institutional framework. Prabhupada created a spiritual society, which he named ISKCON. And some people, I think this is somewhat delusional, think they can be like Prabhupada and they can create an international society for Krishna consciousness with some name. But as far as I've seen, after all the years I've been in this, benighted planet. I mean, for all that I've seen, I've only seen one person in my whole life, including myself, that actually had the purity and the power to create a powerful international society for Krishna consciousness that would actually historically survive and change the world, and that's Prabhupada. I don't see anybody else. I've never met anybody else, including myself, that could actually do that. And inevitably, in any human society, there's going to be a lot of silliness. Bhaktisiddhanta, by the way, is very radical in his statements about religious institutions. And very right on, as they say. People still say that?
Sure.
Am I dating myself? Right on?
Yes.
Okay, still say it. Old people say it.
Oh,
I wouldn't know. So, yeah. So for example, Bhaktisiddhanta said a religious institution is a necessary evil. Just one quote. But necessary. Necessary. So those three things Prabhupada didn't. So those who are committed, seriously committed to preserving those three items as Prabhupada wanted, like we don't change our philosophy, we don't change our basic spiritual practice, and we work within Prabhupada's institution as he set it up. And everyone, including some of our biggest leaders, I think need perhaps a remedial course on actually how Prabhupada set that up, because it was meant to be a constitutional society with justice for everyone. So if you are committed to those things, and you're a lady or a gentleman, you cooperate, you're not like, wild anarchist, then you have a right to engage in conversation and discussion and to voice your concerns. That's the kind of society Prabhupada wanted. We're ladies and gentlemen, faithful to our principles, following Vaishnava etiquette, openly discuss what is best for ISKCON. Not a Shudra society where you're taught to shut up and follow orders. So, anyway, I think that's obvious, and Prabhupada said this. ISKCON exists in order to teach people to be independently thoughtful. So, but as ladies and gentlemen, following Vaishnava etiquette. So, Prabhupada says, sannyasa duty bound to take all these risks without fear. But then at the end he says, one who takes the vow of renunciation of family life need not imitate the Paribrajacacharya like Narada or Lord Chaitanya, but may sit down at some holy place and devote his whole time and energy to hear and repeatedly chant the holy scriptures left by the great acharyas, like the 6 Goswamis. Now, when Prabhupada wrote this before he came to America, and if you hear, according to Prabhupada's own statements, he could not imagine that there would be an ISKCON. Because, look at the history. Previous acharyas, Bhaktivinoda Thakur sent a few books to Canada, McGill University, wherever, maybe a few other institutions. And then Bhaktisiddhanta sent some of his disciples to London, and they kind of didn't win, Gaudiya Math Got Talent. They went to London, and nothing happened, and they came back. And so then Prabhupada was going to try, and so the bar wasn't very high. That's what I want to say. The bar wasn't very high. in terms of, what does it mean for a Gaudiya Vaishnava in Parampara to preach in the West? What did it even mean? Maybe you sell a few books, maybe you meet a few people. There was that German gentleman who became a Vaishnava, and so on. So what did it mean beyond that? And so Prabhupada had dreams of something greater, and he always had this vision, but his expectations, what could his expectations be? And then he took the very bold move, getting on the Jaladuta and coming to America. That was very bold, because no one had ever done that. Well, they'd gone to England. Coming to New York was very bold, or America, landed in Boston. Because to understand how bold it was and how innovative to come to America, you have to remember that Prabhupada lived the first 51 years of his life. For those who are young, that may sound like a lot. For me, it sounds like, okay, not that much. But Prabhupada lived the first 51 years of his life as a subject of the British Empire. First 51 years of his life as a subject of the British Empire. And he lived the first 51 years of his life basically in a world that was Anglo-centric. It wasn't until World War II and its end that world power dramatically shifted from Europe to America. If you look at statistics, for example, let's say before World War I, which is only about 100 years ago. It's only 100 years ago, which is not that much if you actually have a mature brain. Just about 100 years ago, something like 85% of international banking went through Europe. European universities completely dominated science, the humanities, philosophy, history, completely dominated. Like, for example, if you look at Indological studies, Sanskrit and all that, studying India academically, there were one or two American scholars who were in the game, who were, respected. But, almost all the important Sanskritists and Indologists were in Europe. And some in India. Europe, culturally, scientifically, economically, politically, militarily, dominated the world. They owned most of the world because they're colonies. So the world was absolutely Eurocentric in every conceivable way. And of course, then Europe exhausted itself in 2 world wars. So by the time Prabhupada is thinking seriously, I want to go to the West, which was also bold. He did something no one had ever imagined. At least no one in India had ever imagined. He sailed past England and went to America. Which means that Prabhupada really knew what was going on in the world. He knew the world has changed. It's not the same world. And he came to America. So Prabhupada wrote this, that you don't have to travel around, just sit down in a holy place like Vrindavan, where Prabhupada was sitting when he wrote this, by the way. And again, reasonably, what could Prabhupada's expectations be? And they weren't that great. And we know that from his arrival poem. Because Prabhupada says in his arrival poem that, well, Krishna, I don't see how this is going to work, but if you've got some plan, make me dance, because otherwise, it's not, I don't see what's really going to happen here. Because when he arrived, it was just this, there's literally a wall of materialism, because as you approach the Boston Harbor, you just see all these big buildings. It's literally a wall of materialism. It's like Boston's kind of like a minor version of Gotham City. Gotham City's New York. Anyway, so when Prabhupada wrote this, you could say he started to change his tune when ISKCON really started to happen. If you're a sannyasi, you got to go out there and preach. But I think this purport is very interesting and it's still true. I mean, it's still true. There are people that renounce everything and just may not have the health or the energy, or they just somehow can't go out there and travel around and preach. So I think what Prabhupada's saying here is if that's one option, just go to Vrindavan. If you don't take sannyas and just stay at home and sit down in your home and play with your grandkids. If you do take sannyas and you don't have the energy or the ability or the health to travel and preach, at least go to a holy place and just sit down and chant Hare Krishna and read Shastra. But of course, once ISKCON exploded, and Prabhupada himself was astonished, and he said this, he really was like, how did that happen? I mean, he knew it was Krishna. He obviously knew it was Krishna, and then he saw that actually we can win this. We can actually win this. We can not only put a few books in libraries like Bhaktivinoda did, or maybe send some people to the West, to Europe, to meet a few ladies and gentlemen, shake a few hands, and then come home. But actually, we could change the world. And this is something Prabhupada always had that vision. If you read the first canto, which she wrote before he came to the West, I mean, he always had the vision. It's just, there was the vision and there was the reality on the ground, which seemed very different. So, nowadays, of course, so Prabhupada has both options really in this purport. That he's saying Paripajikacharya should travel and preach. In fact, when we took sannyas, there are 4 stages of sannyas. Bahudaka, which somehow means lots of water. But anyway, Bahudaka, Kuti, what is that?
Kutichak?
Yeah, Kutichak, which Kutir means, like Bhajan Kutir. So maybe which one comes first? Kutichak? So there's, it's interesting. There are 4 stages of sannyas. The first stage of sannyas, believe it or not, it's kind of like you're living at home and you have your family. Of course, in India that would be an extended family back in those days. And then you kind of move out of the main house. You make a little cottage for yourself, and you chant Hare Krishna, or you do your bhajan or studies, and then your relatives, they just sort of bring you some prasadam. Hey, I'm in that stage now. They're bringing much. So you stay in a cottage, and it's interesting because it's a transition. I mean, if you've been the pater familias, to use the Roman term, the father of the family, head of the family, and then you actually move out of the main house and you go off, however, 100 yards, whatever it is, a little cottage. It is a change. It's a change. It's not, the romantic idea of the Lone Ranger sannyasi traveling around, but it's definitely a change. And an attached householder would feel it, and the family would feel it, that dad or grandpa doesn't live in the house anymore. He lives out there in the cottage, and he doesn't take part in the family discussions. We sit down and talk about the family business, or when we're just all getting together and laughing and singing and dancing, or having a meal together. He doesn't come. He just stays in his cottage. So it is a change. And you can see it's a transition. It's transitional. And then, after the old man has kind of gotten used to that, you leave the cottage. You just get up your courage. And, it's one thing if you're in ISKCON and you can travel around and stop in temples and, get a free lunch, and maybe if you're lucky, a check for 108. It's it's a little different, and of course back in India there were pious householders everywhere, so a sannyasi could, but sometimes you'd hit hard times, and we see that in the story of the Avantipur Brahmin, late in the Bhagavatam, where you can hit a town where everyone says, "Get out of here, you bum." So so it's like those of us who did traveling Sankirtan, everyone that's old enough did traveling Sankirtan. And some towns, everybody's sweet and nice and buys your book. And some towns, just like the only person that wants to talk to you is the sheriff. And so...
At least you get to talk to somebody.
Yeah, at least you get to talk to somebody, yeah.
It takes your money, it takes your car.
Yeah, so... And it's like that for a mendicant. So to actually walk out of the cottage, which means you may not see your family again. And people, as we know in India, and everywhere in the world, but India is probably the champion, people are really attached to their families. They're really attached to their families. And so to say goodbye to your kids, and your grandkids, and everyone, your cousins, you may never see them again. You may have a heart attack. You may just somehow not make it back. And actually, I skipped a stage. That's probably about Jakshari. The
Madhukar.
that's Kutichaka. Madhukari, actually. That's the bee maker, the honey maker. That's what the word means, the honey maker. Actually, the second stage, I think Kutichaka must be the first one because that's the little cottage. Then Bahudaka means that you kind of still hang out in your same neighborhood or part of the world, but you're not that close to your family, they're not bringing you food. You actually go around and beg. You actually have to go around. And that's why they call it the Madhukari, the honey maker, because the bee doesn't stay in one flower. It's just hopping from one flower to another. And obviously, if you stay in one place too long, you could become a nuisance because you're just like literally eating people out of house and home. You don't want to go say a sannyasi, Maharaj, I don't think we can afford this for much longer. And so the idea was that before you become a nuisance, or the people in the house, they have their own duties to perform. They have their own, and so there was this idea that a sannyasi should not become a nuisance. And therefore, after you've kind of gotten used to being away from your family and living out in a cottage, then take the next jump and just wander around and going to different houses, like a bee goes to different flowers, and just beg and sleep wherever you can. And I guess it helps because in India is a tropical climate; it doesn't get that cold at night. But anyway, that's what you do. You travel, you just go around and beg like that. And then the third stage is Parivrajagacchari. We really head out to see the world, and that's what Dhruva's, Narada Muni is doing here. That's why Prabhupada in the first line of the purport talks about a Parivrajagacchari. So now when Prabhupada gave sannyas, we started out at stage 3. I was just married, I had no kids, I wasn't going to sit outside my wife's ashram and just wait for her to feed me. It's like, obviously that'd be a little silly. So Prabhupada started us out at stage 3. Prabhupada started and just travel around the world and preach. So and that's Narada Muni here also. Sannyasi is duty bound to take all these risks without fear. And the most typical sannyasi of the present age is Lord Chaitanya. It's interesting because Prabhupada doesn't say Lord Chaitanya did things that we can't imitate. He said the most typical. One time in Vrindavan, it was toward the end of the Mayapur Vrindavan festival, and I went to say goodbye to Prabhupada in his house in Vrindavan. And Prabhupada was so, alive in the sense that, I think my meetings with Prabhupada, so many meetings with Prabhupada, he always was just talking about things or asking things or telling me things that I didn't ask about. He was very awake and alive and always thinking about things. And so he just said to me, have you read, he said, do you know that song of the 6 Goswamis? And I said, yes, because I used to sing that all the time. And he said, they are the ideal sannyasis. And actually, they revived Vaishnava sannyas. Lord Chaitanya took sannyas from this other impersonal group because there was no accredited Vaishnava sannyas. It's like, for example, at a certain point I wanted to get a formal education, doctorate, and there were no accredited devotee universities. So you have to go to basically a very materialistic university. So in the same way, there were no accredited sannyas degrees among Vaishnavas back then, until Lord Chaitanya took sannyas from another group. But then when Lord Chaitanya sort of ordered the six Goswamis renounced, that was actually the beginning, the restoration of Vaishnava sannyas. So Prabhupada said to me, they were ideal Vaishnava sannyasis, so if you study them in that song, you'll know what ideal sannyas is. And it's interesting because they didn't dress like we do, sannyasis now. They kopina kantastra, they wore kopines and rags. But so they also preached. Of course, they wrote books. Their particular duty was they went to Vrindavan. They excavated Vrindavan. There was no Vrindavan. I mean, the Vrindavan was there, but it wasn't a popular pilgrimage place. It's sort of been forgotten, and it's not like you go now and there's little markers everywhere. This is where Krishna did this. This is where Krishna did that. Temples commemorating different leelas. Now it's an organized pilgrimage place with an infrastructure and residential. You can go there. There's places to stay and hotels and restaurants and everything. Back then, it wasn't there. It was just sort of out in the country. Maybe just a few people living out on farms or something. And so the duty of the Goswamis was really to excavate and restore Vrindavan as a holy place that you can actually visit with infrastructure and temples and places to stay and so on. So, but that's an example of, so there are all these different models of sannyas. And of course the Goswamis wrote books, and these books were distributed widely, and so they were preaching widely through the writing. Anyway, these are some remarks on sannyas. I didn't get into the flora and fauna, but so any questions on all these points?
I wanted to make one comment about
Yes.
what you said about Siddhanta's quote about spiritual communities. I read one recently, Thomas Merton, the Christian theologian. He said the worst form of crucifixion is living in a spiritual community.
He obviously had some bad experiences. God, I wonder where he lived.
So I was wondering, do you have any knowledge of how it came about? Was it Macmillan, or was it some of Prabhupada's first disciples who approached him that he had the comment to Prabhupada's Gita? How was it that it came
That he had
about?
what?
He wrote a quote. He read the Prabhupada's Bhagavad Gita, and there's a quote, in the first Macmillan.
Thomas Merton.
Thomas Merton.
Devotees went out and got those quotes. So, anything else? Yes.
I was just wondering, with the reference to the jackals and the owls and things, could also be, and possibly also, an allegory towards different types of human beings. And
Oh, sure. You can always make allegories.
That
Nowadays, of course, you'd also have to include pit bulls. I know from personal experience, but yeah, I mean, obviously, this is a literal description talking about real animals and birds of prey, but you can always see allegories in it. Anything else? Going, gone. So thank you very much. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.